The August heat of 1492 did not merely settle over Rome, it suffocated it, carrying the distinct metallic tang of the Tiber's stagnant waters and the sulphurous rot of a city in transition. Within the crumbling stone of the Vatican, Pope Innocent VIII lay dying, his breath a shallow rattle that signaled more than the end of a papacy, it signaled the opening of a void. To the Roman populace, an interregnum was a season of sanctioned lawlessness, a time when the thin veneer of ecclesiastical order vanished, replaced by the sharpening of daggers in the shadows of the Orsini and Colonna palaces. In this psychological landscape, power was not a divine gift, but a physical shield. The collective mind of the era was gripped by a profound, restless anxiety, a realization that the Italian peninsula was no longer a collection of sovereign states, but a chessboard for foreign giants. Driven by this existential dread, the cardinals who gathered for the conclave were not looking for a saint, but for a survivor. Among them stood Rodrigo Borgia, a man whose very presence was an affront to the deep-seated xenophobia of the Roman Curia. To the established nobility, he was the Catalan, an interloper from Valencia, whose family had climbed the ranks through the patronage of an uncle, Calixtus III. This outsider status was the defining friction of his career. He was viewed with a lethal suspicion that transcended mere political rivalry. It was a visceral rejection of his bloodline. Consequently, Rodrigo's pursuit of the papacy was never the simple indulgence of a hedonist, despite what the later Black legends would suggest. It was a calculated defensive maneuver intended to construct a fortress around his children. In a world where the Borgia name was a target, the triple tiara was the only helmet thick enough to deflect the coming blows. The evidence of this desperation is etched into the forensic record of the conclave. Letters from the period, including the frantic dispatches of the Ferrarese ambassador, detailed the systematic dismantling of opposition through the promise of lucrative offices. Rodrigo did not merely bribe, he reconfigured the church's infrastructure to ensure his own preservation. The vice-chancellery, the most powerful office in the administration, was handed to Ascanio Sforza, not as a gift, but as a ransom for the security of the Milanese alliance. Had Sforza's ambition been slightly more patient, or had the French influence in the conclave been anchored by a more competent envoy, the Borgia ascent would have been strangled in the cradle. The history of the world turned on the pivot of a few forged alliances and a shared fear of the alternative, a papacy under the thumb of the Roman barons who would have surely purged the Spanish contingent with clinical efficiency. The atmosphere inside the sealed Sistine Chapel was one of claustrophobic tension. Johann Burckhardt, the Alsatian master of ceremonies, whose diary serves as the forensic anchor for this era, recorded the minutiae of the proceedings with a detached, almost chilling precision. He noted the way the cardinals slept on makeshift cots, the quality of the watered wine, and the precise moment the white smoke finally rose on the morning of August 11th. Burckhardt was a man of the institution, a shadow who saw the human fragility behind the liturgical mask. He watched as Rodrigo Borgia was transformed into Alexander VI, observing the new pope's trembling hands as he accepted the keys of St. Peter. In that moment, the weight of the golden cage became manifest. Alexander was not a conqueror entering a captured city. He was a fugitive claiming the only sanctuary left to him. The papacy was a throne built upon a minefield of ancient Roman vendettas and shifting European loyalties. Inevitably, the acquisition of the tiara did not grant the Borgias peace. It institutionalized their vulnerability. They were now the custodians of a temporal power that was inherently fragile,
a patchwork of rebellious territories and bankrupt treasuries. This fragility forced the family into a cycle of aggression that was perceived by their contemporaries as naked ambition, which functioned internally as a survival mechanism. To hold Rome, they had to break the Orsini. To break the Orsini, they needed the wealth of the church. To secure that wealth, they had to appoint family members to key positions, thus fueling the very accusations of nepotism that undermined their legitimacy. It was a self-consuming logic. The spirit of the times was one of virtù in a Machiavellian sense, not moral goodness, but the strength to impose one's will on a chaotic reality. Yet, for all his perceived strength, Alexander was constantly reacting to a world he could not control. When the French king, Charles VIII, began his descent into Italy, the Borgia papacy was nearly decapitated before it could even begin its second year. The family's survival depended on a series of frantic, improvised alliances that left them deeper in debt and more isolated from the traditional power structures of Italy. The papacy, rather than being the ultimate prize, became a relentless master that demanded the sacrifice of their reputation and eventually their souls. Consider the perspective of a minor clerk in the apostolic camera. A man's name is lost to all but the most obscure ledgers, tasked with auditing the sudden influx of Spanish relatives into the Vatican's payroll. He would have seen not a grand empire being built, but a family barricading the doors with gold and titles, aware that the moment the money ran out, the Roman mob and the French cannons would be at the gates. This was the reality of the Borgia mastery. It was a frantic, day-to-day struggle against an inevitable collapse. The counterfactual tension of the era suggests that had Rodrigo died just 5 years earlier, or had he failed to secure the Sforza vote, the Borgia name would likely be a footnote in Valencian genealogy, rather than a synonym for corruption. Their infamy was the price of their longevity. The sheer scale of their defensive maneuvers, the fortification of Castel Sant'Angelo, the marriage alliances of Lucrezia, the brutal campaigns of Cesare, were a direct response to the precariousness of their position as outsiders. The legacy of this desperate era remains woven into the very fabric of the modern world. The concept of the nepotistic state and the subsequent reforms of the Council of Trent were reactions to the Borgia survival strategy. Even the physical borders of the Vatican City today, a sovereign entity within a capital, echo the Borgia realization that the Church required a territorial buffer to survive the whims of secular princes. The golden cage of St. Peter shaped the modern papacy into a political actor, a role it would not fully shed for centuries. As the bells of St. Peter's rang out in 1492 to announce Alexander's election, they did not herald a new age of enlightenment or even a new age of sin. They announced the beginning of a siege. Rodrigo Borgia had won the throne, but in doing so, he had ensured that his family would spend every waking moment thereafter fighting to keep their heads above the rising tide of a world that would never truly accept them. The tiara was on his head, but the minefield remained beneath his feet, and the fuse was already burning.
In the Rome of the late 15th century, power was not an abstract concept, but a physical weight, measured in the thickness of fortress walls and the depth of bloodlines. Rodrigo Borgia, reigning as Pope Alexander VI, viewed the Italian peninsula not as a collection of sovereign states, but a fractured mosaic waiting to be cemented by his own kin. To achieve this, he engineered a rigid binary structure for his house, a traditional division of labor intended to secure the Borgia legacy for generations.
Juan, his eldest and favorite son, was designated the secular sword, invested with the dukedom of Gandia and groomed to lead the armies of the church. Cesare, the younger brother, was conversely funneled into the ecclesiastical machine, elevated to the purple of a cardinal to manage the spiritual and administrative heart of the Vatican. This was the blueprint for a dynasty, a calculated separation of the holy and the profane that ignored the jagged reality of human temperament. Driven by this dynastic obsession, Rodrigo believed he could suppress the volatile nature of his children through the mere imposition of titles, failing to see that he was not building a foundation, but rather constructing a pressure cooker. The psychological landscape of the 1490s was one of profound anxiety, where the line between divine favor and worldly catastrophe was razor thin. It was a time when men believed their fates were written in the stars, but could be altered by the edge of a blade. In this atmosphere, the clerical robes Cesare was forced to wear felt less like vestments of grace and more like a shroud. Evidence of his psychological resistance survives in the meticulous records of his household expenditures, which show a staggering investment in horses, hunting dogs, and fine steel, the trappings of a prince, not a priest. While he was required to preside over the rituals of the church, Cesare's mind was perpetually elsewhere, tracing the tactical maps of the Romagna. He moved through the Vatican with a cold, predatory grace, his silence interpreted by many as piety, though those closer to him sensed the simmering resentment of a man denied his true nature. Consequently, the very institution he was meant to protect became his gilded cage, and the brother he was meant to support became the primary target of his envy. Inevitably, the friction between the siblings began to manifest in public displays of dysfunction that threatened the family's carefully curated image of unity. Juan Borgia was a man of immense vanity, but limited capability, a peacock who mistook his father's affection for his own merit. In the winter of 1496, the fragility of the Borgia military plan was laid bare during the campaign against the Orsini family. Rodrigo had entrusted Juan with the command of the papal forces, expecting a swift and decisive victory that would consolidate Borgia control over the lands surrounding Rome. Instead, the campaign became a masterclass in incompetence. A letter written by a weary captain in the papal camp described the scene at the siege of Bracciano, where Juan's lack of tactical discipline led to a series of avoidable skirmishes and a devastating loss of morale among the Swiss mercenaries. Juan spent more time polishing his silver armor than surveying the terrain, and when the Orsini launched a counterattack, the Duke of Gandia's leadership dissolved into chaos. The defeat at Bracciano was more than a military setback. It was a rupture in the Borgia mythos. Had the rain stopped an hour earlier on the day of the final assault, or had Juan listened to the counsel of his more experienced lieutenants, the Orsini might have been crushed, and the family's secular authority would have been absolute. Instead, the failure signaled to the rest of Italy that the Borgia lion had no teeth. This collapse of military prestige placed an unbearable strain on the internal cohesion. Cesare, watching from the sidelines in Rome, saw his brother's failure not as a tragedy for the family, but as a validation of his own hidden ambitions. The psychological divide deepened. Where Juan was reckless and loud, Cesare became precise and lethal. The household became a microcosm of the very chaos they sought to control, with servants and courtiers forced to choose sides in a cold war between the brothers that grew more dangerous with every passing month. To understand the human cost of this rivalry, one must look to the figures who existed in the margins of the Borgia court. A 22-year-old stable hand named Matteo, who had served the family since their arrival from Spain, recorded in a rare moment of literacy how the tension in the papal apartments felt like the air before a lightning strike. He watched as the brothers passed each other in the courtyard, Juan shouting commands to his grooms, while Cesare watched from a high balcony, his hand resting on the hilt of a dagger hidden beneath his cardinal's silk. Matteo noted that even the horses seemed to sense the malice, growing skittish whenever the two men were in the same vicinity. This was the reality of the Borgia regime, a dynasty built on the wreckage of personal identity, where the brothers were not permitted to be men, but were forced to be icons of their father's ambition. As Juan's incompetence continued to drain the papal treasury and erode the family's political capital, Rodrigo's desperation grew. He doubled down on his support for his eldest son, blinded by a father's love, or perhaps a refusal to admit his grand strategy was flawed. This favoritism only served to accelerate Cesare's radicalization. The younger brother began to realize that as long as Juan lived, he would be forever tethered to the altar, a fate he found increasingly intolerable. The rigid structure of the firstborn's shadow was not a shield, but a weight that was slowly drowning them all. The division of labor, once seen as the family's greatest strength, had become their most lethal vulnerability. The stability of the regime was now dependent entirely on a sibling relationship that had turned toxic, a foundation of salt that would inevitably dissolve at the first sign of a storm. The legacy of this internal fracture can still be traced in the modern understanding of political dynasticism. The Borgia failure was not merely of morality, but of organizational psychology, a failure to account for the human element in the machinery of statecraft. Today, the ruins of the Orsini fortresses stand as silent witnesses to Juan's inadequacy, while the corridors of the Vatican still echo with the ghost of Cesare's ambition. The shadow cast by the firstborn in the 1490s created a template for the tragic heir, a figure whose unearned power serves only to ignite the fires of those forced to stand in their wake. In the end, the Borgias were not destroyed by the armies of France or the intrigues of the Sforzas, but by the fundamental impossibility of their own design, a design that demanded the sacrifice of the individual for the sake of a crown that neither brother was truly capable of wearing in peace. The friction between Juan and Cesare was the sound of a dynasty tearing itself apart from the inside out, a warning that the most dangerous enemies are often those who share your blood and sit across from you at the dinner table.
On the night of June 14, 1497, the Tiber did not merely swallow a body, it consumed the original blueprint of the Borgia dynasty. The disappearance of Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, and the Pope's favored son, initially appeared as a common Roman tragedy, a nobleman lost to the city's labyrinthine shadows. When his body was finally dragged from the river's silt 2 days later, still dressed in his velvet finery with 30 gold ducats untouched in his purse, the motive shifted from robbery to something far more systemic. Rodrigo Borgia, reigning as Pope Alexander VI, collapsed into a grief so profound that he fasted for days, weeping behind the closed doors of the apostolic palace. Yet within this vacuum of sorrow, a new and more lethal ambition began to crystallize. Driven by the sudden absence of his primary secular heir, Rodrigo was forced to look toward his second son, Cesare, then a prince of the church draped in the cardinal's purple. This transition was not merely a change in personnel, but a fundamental recalibration of how the papacy interacted with the world. The church was no longer just a spiritual vessel or a diplomatic arbiter. It was to become a furnace for the forging of a Borgia kingdom. Cesare Borgia did not possess his brother's easy charm, but he held a cold, analytical intellect that viewed the map of Italy as a series of kinetic problems.
In 1498, in a move that shattered centuries of ecclesiastical tradition, Cesare became the first person in history to resign his cardinality. This was not an act of piety, but a declaration of war. By shedding the robes of a priest for the steel of a condottiero, he signaled to the Italian peninsula that the Borgias were no longer content with the ephemeral influence of the papacy, which expired with the death of the incumbent. Consequently, the family's survival necessitated the creation of a heritable state, a territorial bulwark in the Romagna that could outlast Rodrigo's pulse. To achieve this, the Vatican treasury was effectively converted into a military war chest. Gold meant for the defense of Christendom was diverted to pay for Swiss mercenaries and the services of engineers like Leonardo da Vinci, who mapped the marshes and fortifications of the north with a precision that turned geography into a weapon. The zeitgeist of the era was one of violent transition, where the old feudal loyalties were being eroded by the sheer weight of gold and the terrifying efficiency of gunpowder. Evidence of this forensic shift is found in the testimony of Giorgio degli Schiavoni, a simple timber merchant who watched from his boat as the Duke's body was dumped into the river. He noted that such sights were common, yet the silence following Juan's death was different. It was the silence of a city holding its breath. In the months that followed, that silence was replaced by the thunder of French-supplied cannons. Cesare's campaign in the Romagna was characterized by a speed that confounded his enemies. One by one, the fortresses of Imola, Forli, and Rimini fell. At Forli, Caterina Sforza, the tigress of the Romagna, stood upon the ramparts in mourning black, defying the Borgia advance until the very walls crumbled. Had the French king, Louis XII, delayed his support by even a single season, Cesare's momentum might have stalled against the winter snows. Instead, the timing was surgically perfect, allowing the Borgias to slice through the old order. In this chaos, a 19-year-old soldier from the Romagna countryside, whose name is lost to time, likely died in the mud of Trench, never understanding that his life was the currency spent to buy a prince his throne. The military campaign was half the architecture of conquest. To sustain the war, Rodrigo began an aggressive nepotism and judicial seizure within the Roman Curia. The College of Cardinals, once a body of peers, was systematically hollowed out. Wealthy prelates were accused of heresy or treason, their estates confiscated to fund Cesare's ever-growing army. This created an atmosphere of forensic paranoia within the Vatican halls. Every meal was a potential poison, every hallway a site for an ambush. The traditional power sharing between the Pope and the Roman nobility, the Orsini and Colonna families, was incinerated, replaced by a centralizing terror. The alienation of the Curia was a calculated risk. Rodrigo knew that by destroying his internal rivals, he was removing the only checks on his power, even if it meant the family would have no allies left once his own strength failed. Inevitably, this reliance on terror reached its zenith at Senigallia in December 1502. Facing a conspiracy from his own disgruntled captains, Cesare did not meet them in open battle. Instead, he invited them to a feast of reconciliation. With a chilling display of theatrical hospitality, he lured them into a trap where they were strangled by his henchman Micheletto Corella, while Cesare himself waited in the next room, listening to the muffled thuds of his problems being solved. This event represented the birth of the modern political operator, the ruler who understands that the appearance of virtue is useful, but the utility of fear is absolute. The Romagna was consolidated not through loyalty, but through the elimination of every alternative. The campaign was an expensive, bloody success that transformed the Papal States from a collection of fiefdoms into a centralized military power. Yet this entire structure was dangerously fragile, dependent entirely on the health of the aging Rodrigo and the tactical brilliance of his son. The price of this ambition was the total secularization of the Borgia legacy. By 1503, the family had moved beyond defensive maneuvering. They were the masters of central Italy. However, the cost was the permanent erosion of the papacy's moral authority. The transformation of the Holy Seat into a dynastic engine left a scar on the institution that contributed to the growing resentment in Northern Europe. Today, the administrative structures and centralized control first trialed in the blood-soaked mud of the Romagna remain the foundational DNA of the modern nation-state. The borders Cesare drew and the methods he employed created a blueprint for governance that prioritizes the state's survival over any individual morality. This chapter of history remains a testament to the moment when the Church stopped looking towards the heavens and began, with cold and calculated precision, to conquer the earth. The Borgia name became synonymous with this shift, a legacy of a father's grief and a son's hunger for a crown that was never supposed to be his.
In the late summer of 1503, Rome was not merely a city, it was a pressurized vessel of stagnant air and simmering resentment. The Tiber, reduced to a sluggish, foul-smelling thread, offered no relief from the heat wave that contemporary diarists described as an omen written in the very temperature of the stones. The Italian peninsula existed in a state of nervous equilibrium, a peace maintained only by the shadow of the Borgia bull and the bottomless coffers of the Holy See. For a decade, Rodrigo Borgia, reigning as Pope Alexander VI, had utilized the spiritual authority of the papacy to fund the secular ambitions of his son, Cesare. It was an unprecedented fusion of the sacred and the profane, a dynastic project that sought to carve a unified kingdom out of the fractured mosaics of the Romagna. Yet, this entire imperial architecture rested upon a singular biological fact: the heartbeat of a 72-year-old man. Consequently, when that heartbeat faltered during a humid evening at the villa of Cardinal Adriano da Corneto, the foundations of the Borgia state began to liquefy before the first symptoms of fever had even fully manifested. Driven by the oppressive humidity of August, the Pope and Cesare had sought the relative coolness of the Cardinal's gardens, but the Roman malaria, known then as the terzana, cared little for rank. Within days, both men were gripped by a violent, racking sickness. In the 16th century mind, power was not an abstract concept of law or bureaucracy, it was an extension of the ruler's physical vitality. As the news of the Pope's illness seeped through the porous walls of the Apostolic Palace, the city entered a state of psychological paralysis. Shops were shuttered with heavy iron bars, and the wealthy fled to the Alban Hills, fearing the inevitable explosion of violence that historically accompanied a papal vacancy. Behind the closed doors of the pontiff's chambers, the atmosphere was one of clinical horror. Johannes Burckhardt, the papal master of ceremonies, recorded with forensic detachment the rapid decomposition of the living pope. Driven by the internal heat of the fever, Rodrigo's skin turned the color of bruised plums, his tongue swelled until he could no longer speak, and his body bloated to twice its natural size. Inevitably, the death of Rodrigo VI on August 18th triggered a mechanical collapse of the Borgia apparatus. The treasury, which had functioned as the engine of Cesare's mercenary armies, was immediately frozen by the College of Cardinals. Without the flow of gold from the Vatican, the loyalty of the professional captains, men who had bled for Cesare in Urbino and Forlì, evaporated as quickly as the morning mist over the Tiber. Had Cesare been healthy, he might have used his veteran troops to intimidate the conclave and secure a favorable successor. He was a man who famously claimed to have prepared for every contingency except his own physical incapacity. Instead, at the very moment his empire required his decisive presence, the Duke of Valentinos was trapped in a nightmare of medical desperation. He was subjected to the brutal remedies of the era, including being submerged in a vat of ice-cold water and wrapped in the steaming, disemboweled carcass of a mule to draw out the toxins. This tactical paralysis proved fatal to his cause. A 22-year-old valet named Agostino, who had spent 3 years polishing the Duke's armor and witnessing his terrifying temper, now stood by the bed, watching the most feared man in Europe struggle merely to draw a breath. For Agostino, the history of Italy was no longer found in the maps of the Romagna, but in the labored, rattling lungs of a man who could no longer lift a sword.
The vacuum of power was sensed instantly by the dispossessed lords of central Italy. Like vultures returning to a carcass, the families whom the Borgias had spent years suppressing, the Colonna, the Orsini, the Sforza, and the Baglioni, crossed the borders of their former territories within 48 hours of the Pope's death. The Romagna, a region Cesare had supposedly pacified through a mixture of administrative reform and spectacular violence, proved to have no indigenous loyalty to the Borgia name. The cities of Rimini, Pesaro, and Piombino opened their gates to their old masters, demonstrating that Cesare's conquests were tied to the person of the Duke rather than the institution of the state. The fragility of the Borgia design was laid bare. It was a military occupation masquerading as a government, and without the threat of the Duke's presence or the Pope's purse, the inhabitants chose the familiar tyranny of their local lords over the innovative autocracy of the newcomer. The counterfactual tension of the moment is staggering. Had the fever claimed Rodrigo, but spared Cesare's strength for just 1 week, the Duke might have mobilized the 12,000 troops he held near Rome to dictate the terms of the next papacy. Instead, the suddenness of the crisis forced Cesare into a desperate compromise. He supported the election of Francesco Piccolimi, a frail man who took the name Pius III and died after only 26 days. This brief intermission only served to allow Cesare's enemies to further coordinate their efforts. Consequently, the Second Conclave of 1503 resulted in the elevation of Giuliano della Rovere, the Borgia's most implacable rival, who ascended the throne as Julius II. Cesare, still weakened and desperate for a protector, mistakenly believed that he could trade his remaining influence for the new pope's support. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Julius II was a man of the old Roman nobility, a warrior pope who viewed the Borgias not as legitimate rulers, but Spanish interlopers who had parasitized the church. The transition of power revealed the final bitter irony of the Borgia legacy. Julius II did not dismantle the centralized power structure the Borgias had built, he simply took it for himself. He used the very administrative tools and territorial consolidations Cesare had pioneered to build a more formidable, institutionalized papal state. The Borgias had functioned as the necessary, blood-soaked architects of a new order, yet they were discarded the moment the mortar was dry. The fever of 1503 was the catalyst that ended the dream of a secular Borgia kingdom, but it ensured that the papacy would remain a dominant political and military force in Europe for the next 300 years. Today, the lavish apartments Rodrigo Borgia commissioned in the Vatican remain largely sealed off, their frescoes a silent testament to a dynasty that vanished almost overnight. The modern visitor walks through a Vatican whose physical and political boundaries were traced in the blood of the Romagna campaigns, a reminder that the institutional stability of the Church was bought with the chaotic, fevered collapse of a single family's ambition. The Borgias did not fail to change the world, they simply failed to survive the world they had changed.
The death of Rodrigo Borgia, known to the world as Pope Alexander VI, did not merely signal the end of a controversial reign, it triggered a systemic rejection of the biological papacy that had threatened to turn the Holy See into a hereditary monarchy. In the sweltering Roman August of 1503, the air was thick with the scent of stagnant Tiber water and the palpable dread of a city in transition. The collective psychological state of Rome was one of suspended animation, a mixture of terror and predatory anticipation. For over a decade, the Borgia bull had cast a long shadow over the Italian peninsula, and now, as the Pope lay dying, the city held its breath. The atmosphere was not of mourning, but of a clearing storm, where the survivors of the old Roman nobility prepared to reclaim what had been stripped from them by the Pope's ambitious son, Cesare. Driven by the sudden vacuum of authority, Cesare's fragile alliances he had built through blood and bribery began to fracture before his father's body had even cooled. Inevitably, the collapse of the Borgia enterprise was accelerated by a cruel stroke of timing that historians have long identified as the ultimate what-if of the Italian Renaissance. Had Cesare Borgia been healthy when his father expired, the history of Europe might have been written in the ink of a unified Italian kingdom 3 centuries before its time. Instead, Cesare lay incapacitated in the next room, gripped by the same violent fever and bile that claimed the Pope. This coincidence of illness was the pivot upon which the fate of the dynasty turned. The Venetian ambassador, Antonio Giustinian, recorded with forensic coldness how the Pope's corpse blackened and swelled in the heat, a visceral detail that the Roman public interpreted as divine judgment rather than mere pathology. Consequently, the mechanisms of power that Cesare had meticulously engineered, the control of the College of Cardinals and the command of the papal armies, stalled at the very moment they required a decisive hand. Without his father's spiritual authority to legitimize his secular violence, Cesare became merely another mercenary in a land that was quickly tiring of them. The transition of power was swift and surgical. The election of Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II represented more than a change in leadership. It was an institutional exorcism. Julius, a man whose hatred for the Borgias was a foundational element of his identity, understood that to save the papacy, he had to destroy the Borgia memory. He famously refused to inhabit the Borgia apartments, declaring he would not be haunted by the sacrilegious images of his predecessor. This began a period of damnatio memoriae, where the very architecture of the Vatican was scrubbed of the family's presence. A nameless stonemason, working in the dim light of the apostolic palace, spent weeks chipping away the heraldic bulls from the friezes and doorframes, a silent witness to the erasure of a legacy. This individual act of labor mirrored the grander political movement to redefine the Borgia years as an aberration of secular evil rather than a product of the era's systemic corruption. For Cesare, the descent from aut Caesar or nihil, either Caesar or nothing, to the latter was agonizingly slow. Stripped of his titles and abandoned by his allies, he was eventually betrayed by the Spanish and imprisoned. His final end in 1507, in a muddy, rain-slicked ditch outside the walls of Vienna, was a far cry from the velvet-lined halls of the Vatican. He died in a skirmish, his body stripped of its fine armor and left nearly naked, recognizable only by his old scars. The short, chaotic sentences of his final struggle reflected the breakdown of the grand strategy he had once championed. He had been the architect of a new kind of statecraft, one praised by Machiavelli for its ruthless efficiency, yet he died as a footnote in a small territorial dispute. His death marked the final failure of the Borgia military project, ensuring that the Romagna would return to the direct control of the church rather than becoming a private fiefdom for a single family. Lucrezia Borgia, meanwhile, provided a different kind of survival. In the court of Ferrara, she reinvented herself, not as the temptress of legend, but as a shrewd political survivor and patron of the arts. Her transformation was a calculated necessity. To survive the fall of her house, she had to embody the virtues her father and brother were accused of lacking. Letters from her later years, written in a delicate, steady hand, reveal a woman preoccupied with the education of her children and the stability of her duchy. She became a shield for the family name, using piety as a defensive armor against the vitriol being poured upon her lineage in Rome. However, even her quiet competence could not stop the construction of the Borgia myth. As the Counter-Reformation gathered pace, the Church needed a scapegoat to explain the moral crisis that had led to the Protestant Reformation. The Borgias were the perfect candidates.
By focusing on the poisoned chalice and the alleged excesses of Alexander VI, the Church could argue that its problems were the result of a few wicked individuals, rather than a fundamental flaw in the institution itself. This narrative of infamy was not merely a byproduct of gossip, but a deliberate cultural construction. Historians like Francesco Guicciardini utilized the Borgia story to illustrate the dangers of unbridled ambition, ensuring that the family's name became synonymous with the darkest impulses of the Renaissance. The spirit of the times had shifted from the expansive, often libertine curiosity of the late 19th century to a defensive, moralistic rigidity. The Church, under the threat of Lutheranism, restructured the papal office to ensure that no single family could ever again treat the Vatican as a private inheritance. New rules regarding the conduct of cardinals and the administration of church lands were implemented as direct correctives to the Borgia era. The papacy evolved from a Mediterranean princedom into a global spiritual bureaucracy, a transformation driven by the trauma of the Spanish Pope's reign. Today, the legacy of the Borgias is visible not in the monuments they built, for many were destroyed or renamed, but in the very laws that govern the modern Holy See. The strict protocols of the conclave and the financial oversight of the Vatican Bank are the distant descendants of the reforms that followed the Borgia collapse. The architecture of infamy was a blueprint for a more resilient, if more cautious, institution. The family remains a cautionary tale for the architects of power, a reminder that the tools used to secure a dynasty, nepotism, violence, and the blurring of sacred and secular lines, are the same tools that ensure its eventual erasure. The border between the medieval world and the modern state was drawn in the blood and ink of the Borgia fall, a line that still divides the concept of private power from public office in the Western imagination.